Shabbat shalom, everyone. So I just wanted to say, for those of you who are watching this now, after it's been recorded, thank you so much for your prayers for Brighton. I really appreciate that. I appreciate the support and the statements of faith that have been said. This is a intriguing parasha that we are stepping into at this moment. There are a couple things that are important about it. The first one being that basically we are in a state of kind of almost a fulfillment. I'm very, very cautious with that word, but there's almost a fulfillment of what um, what happened with Abraham and what is about to transpire with Moshe. There's a few reasons for this, and the first one is simple. This parasha is called "And I Appeared," right? This is Va Yira, right? The parasha where he appeared in Genesis chapter 18 is Vayira, and he appeared. And so it's almost like there's a reference back to that parasha. Okay. And it's interesting because that parasha begins with a promise that Rabbi Shaul eventually used to make an argument about the adoption, right? The adoption of the sons of God, as it were, right? So basically, this is in Romans 9, right, where he says, not all Israel's Israel, but only the son of the promise is actually the children of God, right? By Isaac shall your name be called. That's Vayira. Vayira is actually a reference back to that. It's a remez. It's a thematic connection that the Father himself is making for Moshe. Now, there's some intriguing elements to that, but basically, I just really quick wanted to show you what that looked like in the Hebrew. So what we'll do is we'll start with the English. We'll start with the English in Exodus chapter 6. That's where this parasha begins. Okay. It says, then Yahweh told Moshe, now you will see what I will do to Paro. When he feels the force of my strong hand, he will let the people, he will let the people go. In fact, he will force them to leave this land. And God said to Moses, I am Yahweh Elohim, right? But then in verse 3, it says, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Yaakov as El Shaddai, God Almighty, but I did not reveal my name Yahweh to them. Now, so basically, what I want to show you here is basically where it says this in the scroll. Okay. Now, the relevance of this is going to become apparent as we look through the scriptural elements. Okay. But let's go ahead and take a look at the scroll really quick. And let's see what it actually says here. Okay. So basically, this right here is the part where this parasha begins. Okay. Now it says, and he spoke Elohim to Moshe and said, right, to him, I am Yahweh. And then there is Vayira. I appeared right there. Okay. Now, the reason why I want to show you that in the scroll is I will remind you that this is the standard. This is the instrument of agency given to humanity from the Father, the instructions of God. Okay? Known as Torah in the Hebrew, which means instructions, known as the law to the unlearned and to those who wanted to position it in such a way that it became a burden. Okay? But the reason I wanted to show you that is because I want to actually move the scroll to a very specific section. We'll do that now because I want you to see I want you to see a section or a verse in this in this parasha. Let's see, about right there, and I'll zoom in. Okay, and I want you to see that right here it says Vayichra, Vayichra. Okay, I'm going to leave my pen right there for a moment, and I'm going to show you the verse that we're going to be looking at today. In this verse, there is a statement said here by Pharaoh. Okay, now we've kind of dealt with we've kind of dealt with the concept in the story of the Pesach, right? In the story of the Passover, we have dealt with the concept of Pharaoh hardening his heart. And we have dealt with the dysfunction of his pride and then his starting to change his mind and then going back again, right? But this part right here, I think people miss, and I think it is a very important verse. And in this parasha, it happens to be the confirmation of the message that the Father gave me this week. So I will show it to you here in verse 25. It says, Paro called for Moses and Aaron. All right, go ahead and offer sacrifices to your God, he said, but do it here in this land. Verse 26, but Moses replied, that wouldn't be right. The Egyptians detest the sacrifices that we offer to Yahweh, our Elohim. Look, if we offer our sacrifices here, the Egyptians can see us, or where the Egyptians can see us, they will stone us. Okay? Now, there's something very important here, but I'm going to just go ahead and show you the Hebrew. We use the Westminster Leningrad Codex for that. But you notice here is that verse saying to them, go, or you may sacrifice, right? That's the word there in the Hebrew is that zavachu. So looking back now at the scroll, what we have is that same thing. And Pharaoh, and he called Pharaoh to Moshe, right? And to Aharon, saying, all of you may sacrifice, right here, may sacrifice. That's the specific Hebrew word we're going to be looking at, is the word sacrifice, okay? Now, we're going to go ahead and go into the Hebrew here in the interlinear, and we are actually going to be looking at this word sacrifice. So you could see it's this one right here, okay? So we jump into that word zavach, zavach, to slaughter, to kill, to slaughter for sacrifice, okay? I want to talk to you a little bit about something, okay? There is a sentiment among the people of the world I would say that it was propagated very thoroughly by the Greek Empire. The Empire of Greece had something called Hellenism, which was basically a plan to flood the earth with a philosophy, politics, religion, and social justice based upon the intentions of the Greeks. The best way I could put it to you is that they had a philosophy of Western social democratic processes. They had a context or an ideal that was based upon equality. And in addition to that, they had a sentiment for the Olympian pantheon, and all of the Greek mythology that functions within that was actually a blanket process of understanding. But let me explain to you how that was, because it's actually a little bit off from what people think. See, people think that the Greeks were religious. That's not what they were. The Greeks were philosophers, and they had a sentiment that religion was a good way to become a better person. Okay? And so it's not that they necessarily had faith in Zeus, it's that Zeus was a good idea for self-improvement and for the increase of equality. Now, the reason why this is important is because basically what we encounter in this philosophy is a sentiment that you need to trust the experts. And in that process, also, there was a sentiment that there was a mythology necessary for the people to improve themselves and become more civilized. Okay. But in that process, there was still sacrifices. There was still a consumption of indulgences. And in that process, there was also a sentiment of needing to satiate Olympia, to satisfy the gods. Now, however much that was actually a religious devotion and however much that was a good idea, because when you start to look into the philosophers, you will find that they had their opinions about religion, but they were still religious. Okay. Now, there were those who weren't, right? We get into Epicurus and then Diogenes. Those two definitely had shed the religious skin. But one of the most important points about this is that there was a sentiment put forward by the Greeks that religion was a healthy practice in order to better oneself, in order to improve one's life, but was not necessarily true per se, and also was not necessarily mandatory. Now, the reason that this is important is because we can see things like, for example, when certain generals attacked certain groups of people, they would sacrifice their children or they would sacrifice animals, and they would intentionally shed blood, drink blood, make sure that the sacrifice was violent and terrifying for the purpose of satisfying the gods. Now, there's a few very important things you need to understand about that. There was a sentiment that the rain would not fall, the sun would not shine, the whatever would not happen, or the bad things would happen if you didn't do these things. Now, again, remember, it was not necessarily about a devotion. It was a good idea. And to them, it was an integrated part of their society and processes. The reason this is important is because you need to know that although there may be some watching who are not American, because I know we have people in Canada and we have people in Iraq and we've got people in Bangladesh, and I've got friends in Russia who like to watch this stuff. So, going from an American perspective, we have in front of us a Western social, democratic, Hellenistic philosophy, practice, civil processes. They all kind of stem from that same area of Hellenism. Well, unfortunately, that then does trickle into our religion. And what I mean by that is that Christianity at large believes that there needed to be a satiating sacrifice to stay the wrath of God. In fact, the very existence of the page between Malachi and Matthew was based upon a sentiment from a heretic by the name of Marcion, who believed that there was an Old Testament and a New Testament, coined those terms, propagated those terms, and even though he was declared a heretic, excommunicated, and the church, and I'm talking about the church before Nicaea, fought against his heresies, where he believed that God of the Torah was a wrathful demiurge. This comes from a Gnostic belief that the God of the Old Testament was actually Satan, and that the Torah, the Nevi'im and Ketuvim were actually a function of malevolence. Now, in addition to that, we have the idea that Jesus Christ and his Father come to actually kind of put an end to it. Now, let me tell you what solidifies the darkness of Marcion's filth. Enochian doctrine. What's Enochian doctrine? That is the doctrine that angels came down from heaven and they were with the women of humans, and then there was an offspring. There's propagation, that there's a manipulation of DNA, etc., etc., and it all leans towards the sentiment that there was some sort of malevolence to the God of the Old Testament, and Christ comes along and liberates us from the law and liberates us from this demiurge, from this God of the Old Testament, and Christ's Father is not actually Yahweh. Now you say, I never heard nothing so ridiculous in my life. Well, guess what? Yes, you have. You've heard it from the pulpit, that God was a wrathful God and that he was intolerant of his people. And until Christ came, there had to be these blood sacrifices. I'm here to tell you that that actually is not the case. And I'm about to prove it to you. And I'm about to show you a dereliction of doctrine that begins in the garden and works its way all the way through Luther, all the way down into progressive Christianity. You see, the church today has evolved into religious progressivism, which is an intention to move away from dogmatic and strict adherence to faith tenets, and also an intention of what I would call licentiousness, but we'll go a different direction with it, that the Christian church of today has actually evolved into religious entitlement. A sentiment that was propagated by the five solas, right? Sola Scriptura, sola de Gloria, sola Fe, sola Gracia, and sola Christo, which is basically only for the glory of God did Christ die, so that we could be saved by grace through faith. Now, obviously, there's a lot to unpack there. But one of the most important elements of that is those five solas very meticulously and subtly removed Torah as a responsibility and inserted an entitlement to blessing without responsibility. That's what I mean by religious entitlement. You get all the blessings of Deuteronomy 28, but you no longer have to keep Torah. You get all the blessings of and all the promises that were given to Israel and all the promises that God made to humanity without any responsibility towards honoring his instruction. Now, there's also a sentiment in the church that there needs to be an adherence and obedience to the will of God. And to this day, people continue to ask, well, what's the will of God? And to this day, people say, I don't know if I can really hear his voice. Okay? There's a few reasons why this is important. The first is that you need to really understand that this is coming off of an anti-Semitic sentiment. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the five solas are inaccurate or false doctrine. I'm saying that there's another piece. You see, when it said saved by grace through faith, that's good. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. So there was definitely an intention from the Father to impart to us a right standing. No, that's not what righteousness means. A place in which we now have the dominion, power, and collective conscience of the bride without merit. That's a legitimate thing coming out of the five solas. But this is the same man who said, burn their synagogues and tear down their pulpits. This man had no sentiment for the Jew, and he had no sentiment for the Hebrew roots of his own faith. The reason why this is important is because I'm going to show you what has happened. So we'll go all the way back to the garden, and all of a sudden God gives skins to Adam and to Eve. And so immediately someone says, oh, there's the first sacrifice. There's the first bloodletting. There's the first sacrifice of blood. And if they're not satisfied with that blood, then they go to Abel, who brought a worthy sacrifice, but Cain didn't. Because why? Because Cain was religious, right? This is the sentiment of the church today. Cain was religious, Abel wasn't. Because why? Because Abel brought a lamb and Cain brought fruits and vegetables. Then we get into Abraham, and all of a sudden there's this sacrifice where there's a dividing of an animal, and in the dividing of that animal, now there's blood being shed to satisfy this wrathful, malevolent God, right? That's the direction this goes. Listen, you cannot start down this road without eventually accusing God of being malevolent. You can't. Now, as we go through this, eventually we start to get to the sacrifices and offerings that are made in the tabernacle, and we get into this bloodletting, and we get into this wrathful God again. And then eventually we get into this time with David, where he has the design of the temple, and then Solomon sacrifices upwards of like 100,000 sheep in the courtyard of the temple because there wasn't room in the area where the altar was. And then eventually we get into the prophets. And what do we find in the prophets? More sacrifice, more bloodletting. We get into the New Testament, and there's this perfect sacrifice, this perfect bloodletting. Because there's this idea that there was no other way in which God would be merciful, and no other way in which you could have a meritless favor with him. And then there's this sentiment that there had to be this perfect sacrifice to satiate a wrathful God. Now, that sounds about right. Like, I mean, we pretty much just discussed probably 15 of your pastor's sermons this year already, right? And so in that sentiment, now I want to go through and I want to show you something very, very different. As I was meditating and praying this week, the Father kept repeating to me over and over again, sacrifice and offering I have not desired, sacrifice and offering I have not desired, sacrifice and offering I have not desired. And I'm like, what? What do you want? Why do you keep telling me this? Like every time I turn around, I'll be thinking about something and that would pop up. Then I went out to eat with a friend of mine, and his doctrine has a place in it where there's a sentiment for the Ten Commandments, but there isn't a sentiment for the Torah itself. And the big deal was this sacrifice and offerings. Now, a couple of things that are important. The first one is that I want to remind you that the Hellenism is what propagated the sentiment of a need to satiate a wrathful or malevolent God. If you see the reputation of Zeus, you see the reputation of the other gods in the Greek pantheon and mythology, they're acting up. They're acting up, and the only time that it seems like there's actually a legitimate interaction is when there's bloodletting. So going back to Abel, we'll start there, and I'll explain some things. The first one is that the sacrifice that was being brought is very near to and akin to the lamb without blemish during the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. But what are you missing? You're missing the fact that at Passover, if you're in the sentiment of Passover, you most likely will eat lamb. Now, if we go back to the temple times with Yeshua, you will find that they ate the Passover lamb. They ate the sacrifice. And you're going to see this over and over and over again, where it says, you may eat the sacrifice. You may eat the sacrifice. Eat. So what was this from? Now, there's a couple ways that we could look at this, because obviously if we're dealing with secular historians, anthropologists, or archaeologists, one of the things that is going to happen is they're going to say, oh no, this is how the culture was at this time, and that's why this was going on. As a side note, that is one of the things that is present in religious progressivism, is a sentiment that a rule doesn't apply because now we know better. I can tell you that if I jived with that, I would cease being a believer. My faith alone keeps me from dwelling too much upon the logic of that sentiment. The idea that God changes his mind along with the culture is a satanic doctrine. The idea that God would tell a person not to go out on the Sabbath and gather, and a man goes out on the Sabbath and gathers, and then he's imprisoned by the people. Moses addresses God and says, what should I do with him? And God says, let him be killed, let him be stoned. And yet a Gentile, uncircumcised Philistine, as it were, somebody who isn't even circumcised, somebody who isn't even in covenant with God, someone who isn't even sentimental to his Torah, claiming to have upon them the covering of the blood of Christ, and thereby under, quote unquote, the new covenant, can break the Sabbath with intention and with mockery, and yet he doesn't put him to death. That God, if he adapted and lets that one get away with that and this one not, is an unjust God. Now, there's some of you who may say, yeah, but the sovereignty of God, he can do what he wants. Yes, okay. But when the Torah became flesh and dwelt among us, the Torah is not going to violate itself. And so it would be imperative to know what Yeshua said about these things. And we find often the same explanation. Oh, well, that was the culture that time, and that's why he said this the way he did. Now, some of that is important for context. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a balance of anthropology and archaeology brought into our faith. But you can argue out textual criticism, logic, and history to minutia and destroy faith. Now, I want to remind you that the Greeks believed that religion was a good idea, not necessarily that it was true. It was a good practice because in that sentiment, you were bettering self and bettering society. And so as we get into the thought process of sacrifice, there are some things that you should know. When we look at, for example, the Aztecs, and we have a really good kind of snapshot photo, like a brief look at what was going on with them in the movie Apocalypto. And in that process, you can see human sacrifice being carried out with violence because there was a drought, with violence and bloodletting and the destruction of innocence. And one of the key elements of that culture, whether it had been the Aztecs, the Mayans, right? Whether it had been the South American peoples who practiced these things, is they had pyramids. And so, however we look at this, we see that there was a sentiment back then that pyramids played a large and important role in the process of satiating a wrathful God. Now, somebody might say, wait, that doesn't jive, except for the problem that the sacrificial altar is at the top of the steps of the pyramids in South America. Now, why is this important? Because now we can start to see that there would have been human sacrifice in Egypt. There would have been an attempt to satiate a wrathful pantheon of gods with a single leader of the gods and then a whole bunch of other gods. And you figure out how you're not pissing off or you are pissing off a certain god. Now, the relevance starts to come into play as we encounter the thought process of, is that how Yahweh feels, acts, or thinks?